the challenge we always face is, what do you do, right? In the evidence jungle, we're told RCTs are for therapeutic, questions. That is the question, that's the tool you're going to use. But RCTs can be quite dangerous. And I think particularly no more than any other time in history, and I think the last 4 months have helped us think through this. John Ioannidis, who some of you know is an epidemiologist at Stanford, has been speaking about the dangers of research broadly. And he has this really provocative paper, I think it's in PLOS Medicine in 2005, that says why all published research findings are false. And he goes through this whole hypothesis, but small studies is a big part of that central hypothesis. But then you say, okay, well, if RCTs are all bad, well, small ones maybe are concerning. What do we do for the other side, the observational data sets? And then it gets into the whole issue that you discussed. I'm not going to repeat all that, but you raise all the issues that we struggle with. And then we thought, well, what do you trust now? Like what, as a consumer of evidence, what do we trust? Because everything seems to have some degree of challenge, or if not concern. And maybe it's when they align. Every study seems to say, well, we can get a high quality observational study. And there were some papers probably over a decade ago in the New England Journal of Medicine that said, if we do an observational study and we appropriately adjust for confounding, look, our results of observational data are consistent with RCTs. But they were still using the RCT as the benchmark standard. And that's kind of the circular argument, that we get into. So what you present, I think, is fascinating in the concept of, and I think we're going that way. I see Samir Parpia here as well. So I'm going to get you, Samir, to give your thoughts on this, on the McMaster side of things. But platforms, I think, are really useful. And I think finding ways to make trials more efficient and using already data that's collected and minimizing consent, all these things that are just music to my ears when I hear you presenting it. And the fact that you're successfully executing, I think makes it even more exciting, which means, and the question I'll put up first, and I'll let others comment on this, is how can we take what you're doing in Australia and expand that now globally in a way that your 15,000 patients can become 45,000 patients, using the same approach, but maybe thinking even bigger than you are. And you're already thinking bigger than most. So I'm not saying that you've already put a different level on the conventional approach. Let me ask you that. Can this be, what's the reality we could take this model and just grow it and continually grow it across, continents?
That question to me?
Oh, yeah, sure. Go ahead, Ian, or feel free. That I wouldn't mind hearing from others their thoughts on this general issue.
Yeah, I'd like to hear from others. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Well, here. Okay. So, is there anyone else who has a comment before Ian jumps in? Well, let me ask Samir, because I know he's there and I know he's a thoughtful guy. He's probably thinking, "Why are you asking?" But I know you're here. So if you're here, I'm going to ask you.
Yeah, I mean, you nailed it, right? The point is, trials are getting very expensive, and the efficiency is a big thing. Here, I think to do it globally, it's this technology platform. There's privacy issues and all those things you have to take into consideration. But it would be amazing if everybody were to use a platform which could you could nest a trial in and get these long-term outcomes. So, for example, I don't know this field very well, but 2 years seems not an inadequate follow-up time, and you'd like long-term follow-up for about 10 years or so. So it'd be great to do it, but to do it across platforms seems a bit more challenging. So in Australia, they've built a platform where they can do it now. For Ontario to do something like that,
Well, I mean, yeah, and I guess the question I'm asking, Samir, is do you believe the idea of a registry nested RCT makes more sense than our conventional approaches? So registry alone has holes. Small RCTs have tons of challenges. And the biggest challenge I've always found with RCTs is the follow-up and the cost of collecting data, and the amount of time we have to spend to collect 1,000 patients for our trials has been several years. They're collecting 15,000 patients now in 2 years. And that's the cluster crossover design that I know PHRI has been all over. PHRI is the Population Health Research Institute at McMaster.
It's hard to argue.
Very keen on that, yeah.
There is, say, for example, you could in a regular RCT get 15,000 patients and follow them. There is an argument from people at Vanderbilt saying that they think that it is good that an RCT does not mimic real world practice. They think that because it's hard to detect heterogeneity of treatment effects within subgroups, it's hard to do it. We hardly see it.
Yeah.
And they think that on an absolute scale, it's not transportable to the general population. But on a relative scale, so hazard ratio and odds ratio, you can fairly convincingly transport that value, because it's hard to detect any heterogeneity of treatment effects. So I think there's an argument saying that, you know, the generalizability thing is not that big of an issue. Even people try to make it big of an issue. There's an issue, well, it's not in surgery, but adherence to medication is an issue in RCTs, and that you can adjust for. But on the efficiency side, I don't think you can, there is great value in these nested RCTs, because you could just, you know, get these outcomes, get them long-term and recruit faster. But there is an opposite argument of this generalizability, that if you're measuring it on a relative scale, you can transport that treatment effect to a different population, just because it's hard to detect heterogeneity of treatment effects.
Oh, that's very interesting. I want to get Richard, if I could, just to maybe unmute and give his statement. I see a hand up there, but I know he has a thought on observational studies. Richard, did you want to just unmute and share your thought? Now, has he frozen? Okay, I think he may have frozen. I'm going to get Vikas. I think you had a question or thought. Yeah.
Yeah. So Ian, great talk. In fact, all three talks are good. My question is, you're talking only about joint replacements. So all your joint replacements, do you actually do proms on them? Or is it just...
Sorry, my internet's become fragile.
Oh, okay, you know what? If you just hang on for 1 second, I'm going to have Vikas Khandu just speak, and then we'll get you right back in.
So Ian, do you do proms on all your patients as well? And do you actually record that in your registry? Or is it just survival analysis in terms of failure of the joints?
Yeah, so the Australian registry recently, it's 2018, started collecting proms. And so we did a pilot that involved, I think, 44 hospitals. And so we've got data on I think 15 or 20,000 patients in the first sort of year or two, and now we're in the process of rolling that out to other hospitals. So yes, it's now routine for joint replacement in participating hospitals, but that's not every hospital in the country, but it's certainly a lot of them. But the idea is that this platform can now be used for non-joint replacement. So Richard, who's there and is going to talk shortly, he and I have just designed a placebo shoulder surgery trial. And initially, when we were getting the funding for that, we were looking at the possibility of nesting that in the registry, even though the joint replacement registry has nothing to do with rotator cuff disease. They've got the platform to do the trials. They've got the people, they get ethics approval, they do all the legwork for you. They've got the automated system to collect proms. You just have to change the, Oxford knee score to the Oxford shoulder score or whatever it is that you want to do for your outcome. So we're hoping it's going to be, used beyond just joint replacement.
So, our experience is that I ran the National Non-Arthroplasty Hip Registry for hip preservation procedures for about 3 years now in the UK, and we've got about more than 15,000 patients on it. We don't have compliance of more than 50% in these patients, because we're sending them patient-reported outcome measures via email, we're reminding them, but the compliance rates are low. And that's the same problem with the RCTs. If the compliance rates are going to be low on your registries, then you are in the same problem. And the second issue is, what's your primary outcome measure and how do you introduce that into your registry? Unless and until you're going to get a compliance rate of at least 80% plus on your primary outcome measure, that's not going to be a good trial either. So that's the sort of so how do you get around that?
Yeah, so there's two answers to that. First of all, for example, the VTE prophylaxis study that we're doing, now obviously that's going to involve outcomes that are not normally collected in the registry, because we want to find out about clots. We want to find out whether people get a DVT or a PE. And so we've added those questions to the platform, because this platform can just have questions added and subtracted to it. And we want the outcome at 90 days. And so we find out if they had a VTE at 90 days. That's our primary outcome. Now, because that's a nested RCT, we don't just rely on the electronic follow-up. So the electronic follow-up varies between hospitals. And like you say, some hospitals are terrible, some hospitals are good. So we have telephone backup for the RCTs. And so our follow-up rate for the 8 or so thousand that we've collected so far is about 91%. The other answer is that we're just in the middle of writing up a paper looking at whether responses vary according to the proportion of follow-up that you achieve. And it's quite interesting that it doesn't. And so 50% follow-up in a broad PROMS program, I think for an RCT, yeah, I mean, you've got to do better. For an RCT, you've got to be 90%, which is what we're aiming at. But for a broad PROMS program, if you're getting 50% from one hospital and 80% from another, you're probably not necessarily getting a biased sample. You just got a hospital that doesn't follow up very well. So there's some interesting questions that you've raised there, because thanks.
Let me get Dr. Page maybe to come back in. So I think you had a comment that you wanted to share.
Yeah, thanks, Mo, and so apologies for dropping out there at the crucial step. This is a fascinating topic, and firstly, just an observation and a comment, really a question for the group, in that, you know, one of the challenges and criticisms I think has already been alluded to in quite really tight, methodologically tight RCTs is selection bias and external validity, and Ian's touched off on that, and that's a regular criticism. You can make the results look really nice, tight, but how do you transfer that out? So clearly having a broader platform like, for example, the cluster randomization that Ian's spoken to is important. Mo, what you alluded to is this great attraction is how do we go cross-jurisdiction, you know, not just multi-center, but multinational, to make this a more global thing. And an observation, and therefore a challenge there, is data harmonization. Right. And having been involved in a couple of projects doing cross-registry walks, just with, you know, centers offshore, you've got to spend a lot of front-end time doing that, because what you call an apple and what we call an apple may be a banana, you know. And so if you don't have that right, and spend a lot of time doing that at the front end. So I guess the question, and therefore the challenge is, you know, should we be spending more time on data harmonization and outcome harmonization now at the front end before we get too excited about the trials?
Well, yeah, I mean, the way I've always looked at it, and, you know, and what we've learned is, if you find something that works really well and a group of people have figured out how to do it very well, you've got a very strong proof of concept. And this is by no means like an invention that you've had, but you figured out how to make it work, and you're doing it efficiently. Everything about that is expansion. How do you make that now the norm where other people can gain the same benefits? So we're not just continually, you know, not advancing, because we're just all doing other things. Now, that comes under the belief that it is the right way to go and going forward. Let me ask you this. You know, one question I've had, and I suspect this evidence must exist and must be doable. When you look to use registry data as an efficient way to collect outcomes, so, you know, that's a massive shift. That's a massive shift. That and not having to get a consent are two things that completely change the game for research. Now, have you done any sort of comparisons where you say, okay, we did a comparison of a trial that was modeled using registry data, and we actually have an independent large trial that didn't use registry data, and compare those two to say, when we model our nested design, the results against other large gold standards that we know are very expensive, unlikely to be reproduced, but we get the same answer. Because so much of that is about can we approximate what we believe the truth would be if we had the ideal study design. And maybe it's not going to be in orthopedics. Maybe it'll be in other areas where they have large studies like cardiovascular, for example, and they've done crossovers in that area. I'm just curious if there's any way to test that, or just test the robustness of using that model.
Yeah, I don't know of examples, but I think when you look at it, I mean, it is robust because
okay, I believe you. Good. That's all you have to say.
I'll justify it. When you look at cluster randomized trials that have a lot of clusters, I think there's problems when you've got cluster randomized trials with 4 or 5 clusters that don't cross over. You've got huge problems that you probably can't necessarily prove away, But once you get a lot of clusters and you add the crossover, you're going to get very, very comparable groups, and you can test statistically for correlation between clusters and correlation within clusters. To show you that what you've got is a robust answer. But I'll just go back. Maybe it's a little bit of a tangent, but your question before is who do we believe? And I guess that's the topic of this thing is who should we believe? It's always convenient when things do align. And a lot of us tend to look at the differences and think, oh, someone's wrong. And when you look at John's study and you say, look, the RCTs showed there was no difference, but the registry data shows the hazard ratio is 1.9, what's going on? But when you look at it closely, they're very well aligned. They both actually show the same thing because the randomized trials show that there's no difference in the first year or two, which is exactly what John showed with a hazard ratio of 0.98. It's only it's after that it starts to deviate. So, in a way, they support each other. And that makes the finding a bit more robust. It's when you see big differences like they saw in the Women's Health Initiative, but then that makes it interesting. You've got to try and explain, well, which one's wrong? Can we analyze it differently to find out why? And that's exactly what they did, and found the reason why they're different. So normally you end up finding out the truth or a closest estimate of the truth.
I think we continue to evolve. We're all trying to find ways to make, try to get to the answer, but more efficiently get to the answer. And probably nowhere better than the last 4 months have we realized the challenge of doing that when you're, when all the floodgates are opened up and everyone's looking for a cure, let's say in this case for COVID-19, we're seeing, an epidemic of information, and a lot of it is problematic. So we have to find, but platform trials or platform systems have become very, very popular. As you know, the most recent of the group from the UK, Oxford group, just, had their discovery that, steroids may in fact be helpful, but they've been testing 10, 15 different treatments, rapidly. The idea of that, I think, is the future. I don't know what others think who are involved in large programs here, but I would suspect that we're going to see a move to platforms more commonly because they are efficient.
Yeah, I think, and we need to distinguish between a trials platform, which is what we built, and a platform trial, which is something else.
Right. True. Sorry. Right.
And the idea of a platform trial is very attractive, but when you look into it, and even things like response adaptive randomization, all these really neat techniques that people have, they kind of rely on a shortish outcome, and they're really not suitable for, say,
not for joints,
hemiarthroplasties in fractured neck of femur. So you do need, it would probably be better for a, VTE trial or something like that. Maybe that'll be the next one we'll do.
Listen, realizing we are about 5 minutes over, I don't want to keep people from their day, but I would indulge you with one final question, if I could, is what's beyond even where we are now? If you look 3, 4, 5 years ahead, is the world going to be doing what you're doing right now in Australia, or are we going to move to what we've just been seeing happening, which is, machine learning algorithms and quote big data, real big data systems that are, are going to be amalgamating multiple sources and then trying to use computer-based deep learning algorithms. We're seeing lots and lots of in the COVID era now, we saw lots of groups saying we're doing machine learning as a way to quickly extract information from patient charts and be able to assess it. Now, we also saw a particular group lead to 2 retractions in the New England Journal and Lancet all the same day for doing just that. They doing it, rushed it, and didn't do it appropriately, it seems. And there were a few concerns that led to 2 retractions from that type of rapidly collected data set. Not sure we're there yet. Wonder what other people think. And maybe there isn't a thought on it, but I'm just curious. I'm raising it because everyone talks machine learning and big data.
Look, machine learning is just a technique of analysis.
Yeah. But I mean, but I guess it's right. It's the data sets.
Something that sounds cool. But
I
think where we're heading is probably a combination of both. Trials and big data, and where we want to move is an area where we go beyond just joint replacement. For instance, people with osteoarthritis, and to get some kind of regular tracking or feedback from these people where they tell us what treatments they've had. We're now linking our data with the larger government Medicare data as well. So we're going to try and maximize the amount of big data or routinely collected data we can get, supplement that where we need to, and embed trials where we need to.
Wonderful. And I'm just going to ask, I see a hand up. I see Anthony's hand up. Anthony, did you want to unmute and give a quick question, or did we lose you?
Hey, thanks.
Oh, hey,
it's just, again, to chat a bit about this whole machine learning and its role in those retractions from my understanding, machine learning, people may have used it to extract data from the charts, but the Surgisphere papers that were retracted had to do with the fact that they couldn't provide their data at all. From what I remember, it wasn't so much about that they used machine learning in any way in their papers. So I agree, rushed publication, things don't work out, but I think like some of the other speakers mentioned, it's just methods. And the retractions weren't necessarily based on those methods, although certainly in times when people want to rush publications and rush data, anything can potentially be not quite as ideal as it should be.
Wonderful. We have a team machine learning on here, really supporting his cause. Good for you. That's excellent. No, and I agree with you, actually. It's just a matter of, I think we have to be careful because there is no one answer, right? There's no magic bullet that's going to solve all the problems. But I think sessions like this, where we at least get to address the issues and to some degree, we're not a consensus here today, but we're just trying to understand different viewpoints and at least be aware that there's groups trying to push that dial a bit forward. And we'll look forward to hearing more from what's happening in the group, in your team as well, Ian. And obviously, for all of you who attended, thank you very much for taking a bit of time with us today. I hope you found the smaller group approach. We were deliberate, and we had a little bit of backlash from people saying, why didn't you let more people in, and why did you let it as a webinar? I don't think we would have had this ability to have this sort of discussion unless we had invited you all as panelists. So rather than have you all as panelists, we just thought we'd have a small group. Do you mind just filling out a couple of quick 3 questions, and then I'll ask Ian for a final closing statement, if I could.
Okay. Look, I think we've covered all the topics. I think that the future of evidence generation, however it's done, in orthopedics is pretty bright. The fact that a lot of people dialed in to listen to this is encouraging. And I just, again, want to thank you and of course, thank Sam and John. I apologize. I kind of hogged the microphone a little bit in the second half there. And thanks, Mo, and Abby for sort of setting all this up. It's been a great experience.
No, and I can't thank you all again. I always say that as you were all speaking, I was texting away to some friends saying, I love mornings where I get up and actually learn something again. So many things you said I'm aligned with, so I was maybe biased in the fact that I was just smiling away. But that being said, I think we have lots and lots of things we can continue to do together. And I actually do look forward to following up with all of you about some of the things we can be doing together, because the cluster crossover design and the idea of using registry data or local registry for us has also been of interest. The fact that you've been able to do it, I think, is helpful to us, so we can learn from you a bit. And we'll get this last question answered. And I'll thank you all again and wish you all a wonderful evening or a good start to your day.